Hi everybody, I'm Jim Carroll. Is there really a shortage of long-haul fiber in the US? Well, it's been many years since the days of the telecom bubble when Qwest and Williams and Wiltel and Level 3 and it seems like everyone else was out racing to deploy as many long-haul fiber miles as quickly as they could. And we've been living off that fiber glut ever since. There's a new company out of New York that thinks it's time to build again. They're building a wholesale carrier neutral network, pulling as many as 432 fiber strands per duct and linking Chicago to New York and New York to Ashburn, Virginia, and maybe on down the eastern seaboard. So I asked their CEO, Hunter Newby, is there really a shortage of long-haul fiber?
Well, people don't really know what the word fiber means, the definition of the word fiber. And there's some pretty basic fundamental things you need to qualify that word with. And first of all, when someone says fiber, are they referring to carrier-owned fiber? That's for lease. Is it? What is it? If it's not carrier-neutral fiber or fiber that's available for lease or IRU on a long-term basis, then it essentially doesn't exist, because all the other network operators that need it, need access to it to light it themselves, are precluded from doing that. And there's no place that's a greater issue than in the long-haul portions of the infrastructure in the U.S. There hasn't been a new long-haul fiber build around the whole United States in over a decade. And the design that exists that's out there today does not have the handheld access. It also does not have a single carrier-neutral colo distributed out along it, because it's all owned by carriers. And there's nothing wrong with being a carrier, don't get me wrong, those are our tenants. But they're just not in the business of sharing their infrastructure with other network operators at the physical layer. And that is our primary business model. So if you think about the United States today, or any country, and the requirements that it has today to meet the needs of wireless, for example, how do we get LTE to work in America if you don't get fiber to towers? Well, the bigger question is, how do you get the fiber out there to get it to the tower? America is a very large country, and it can't be served by just a few metro networks where people then believe, well, there's an abundance of fiber in certain metros. And I think recently a lot of people's attitudes are starting to change about this, where they used to throw the glut word around a lot. And I'd argue that it's actually a huge drought in America. And for the people that think that there's a glut, they should question why their cell phone calls get dropped all the time and they can't get good video service over their Apple phone or their Droid phone, because there just quite frankly isn't enough fiber to the towers for the backhaul. It's a little bit of a spectrum issue, yeah, but you can manufacture billions of devices in China and billions of antennas, and you can put them on towers, but if you don't have the fiber back from the tower that gets into a core infrastructure, it's not going to work. And that's what we're starting to experience now. People buying 4G network services that just aren't available. People probably get LTE, if they're paying for it every month, they probably get it 5 to 10% of the time a month, if they're lucky. I have 3G service still on an old T-Mobile BlackBerry because I just use it for email, and I have an iPad for my browsing. And I don't even get 3G consistently throughout the day. It kicks me down to Edge, and GPRS, and GSM, and UMA. I frequency hop all day long. There's contention in the spectrum, there's contention in the backhaul, and these are the limitations just with wireless, for example. But I think one of the biggest reasons why, I think, not just a reason, but an example of how we have a problem here, was the broadband stimulus. The U.S. broadband stimulus, by pretty much everyone's accounts, was a disaster. But I always like to say that it did one thing really well. It showed that there's a problem with rural broadband in America. So if there's a fiber glut in America, there wouldn't be a problem with rural broadband. So the fact that the stimulus project was sort of doomed from the start, and a lot of these organizations took the funds to block someone else from getting them, but either didn't intend on deploying it or never really knew how, or were afraid of all the strings that were attached or what have you. A lot of infrastructure hasn't been built. Yeah, there's some projects that have been built or are being built and have worked, but by and large across the country, it really wasn't a holistic plan to solve the issues of the country, sort of like the interstate highway system was in the 50s, that is very analogous to what we're talking about here with fiber. It's based on rights of way, it's based on infrastructure development, and there needs to be one homogeneous plan for the country. It's the only way it's going to be resolved. And again, back to the, is there really demand? Are people using more devices today than they were 10 years ago? Yes. How often do you get a new device now? Once every year or 2 years? There hasn't been a significant upgrade in the fiber infrastructure in America in a decade. but there's been more and more devices coming out every year that are faster and more powerful. So how is that supposed to work on an aging infrastructure that doesn't have access points? And there's many other analogies, but that's really one, the wireless and the rural broadband as well. Distributed cloud computing is another big thing that people talk about and pay lip service to that they don't really understand. Distributed cloud computing actually means that you need to distribute servers to places where the data needs to be stored, or the programs, the algorithms need to be processed. Today we have clusters in major markets, but really nothing in between. And one of the limitations of creating data centers in places where there's cheap power and lots of tax breaks is there's no fiber. There's no data center if there's no fiber. So if you built a superstructure that had access points along the way, then all of that real estate becomes in play. So now you can find where there's green power and abundant power, cheap power, and tax incentives along a main fiber artery that you can essentially tap into anywhere you go. And the real estate then becomes much more malleable than what we have today, which is everything's clustered around metros because that's where the glut of fiber is, or you find a really sweet spot where there's hydropower for 2 cents a kilowatt, maybe that's a little low, 3.5, but there's no glass. So how do you fix that? You have to make an investment, a very smart, logical, systematic investment in the proper design, not just the physical design, but the business model design of fiber infrastructure that allows the metro networks and the muni networks and the wireless networks and the rural networks to all connect and openly and freely interconnect to each other. Creating that thoroughfare is how this problem gets solved.